We're the All People's Health Collective, where organizers, advocates, and everyday people come together to demand care, housing, and freedom for all. APHC is fighting for care without control, housing without conditions, and dignity for every person.
All right, welcome to another All People's Health Collective podcast. This is a APHC on APHC dialogue because we are here with Vanessa Ramos, who some of y'all might not realize started this whole thing. And Vanessa and I are going to have a conversation about substance use. And some people call it substance use disorder. Some people talk about it in the framework of addiction. Some people just say drugs. Most of us who are grown grew up under the war on drugs itself, which included massive propaganda, which informed how we talk and think about this. And the reason Vanessa and I are talking today is because we're kind of on the other side now of midterm elections in really big cities like LA, like New York. But in pretty much every big city, the driving issue, whether truthful or not, whether people want it to be the driving issue or not, the issue that's been pushed is how people are describing cities. And often the issue that they kind of put to the top of their list of complaints is around issues of homelessness, drug use, mental health that's visible, that's in the streets. And I think a lot of us are dealing with the frustration of seeing people pushing the very things that cause the problems as the solution. But it's more complicated than that. So for even added perspective, kind of letting you guys know for context that Vanessa and I have this conversation all the time because it's very much informed our whole lives for lots of different reasons. And I think it took us both a while to realize we should be having this conversation more in this context, publicly, because it's one of these issues that it's fair to say that all sides get it wrong, or at least get it wrong to some extent. Or maybe it's more fair to say not all sides get it right because they avoid some of the nuances, and we could talk about that. But let me just stop and just welcome you, Vanessa. How you doing? It's nice to see you.
So good to see you, Lex. And, hi to everyone who's listening. And, thank you all for, the many years of support, because APHC, really did start as that, we needed a place to kind of let it all out. Many of us work at organizations that maybe it wouldn't be good posture or there's just like nuance there, right? But I feel, Lex, that APHC in your care has really grown to arrive to this place of excellence where, now that economic justice piece really starts to get going, and I love that. And I say this on this call because as we think through, drugs, drug use, substances, substance use disorder, addiction, treatment, medication, we cannot, move away from, the money piece, right? I feel very moved, Lex, by understanding that you get that when we grew up, we're if you don't like us, like blame the 80s, right? We're product of the 80s and shit, 80s and 90s, don't hate on me, hate on Pete Wilson, it it's like we saw peer support programs rise up organically. And I'm not talking about like mental health peer support, like, yes, mental health peer support, but really in hubs throughout Los Angeles, we had, a very clear and clean container for true community health work, right? True peer support, where many of us were involved in these teen programs, that were intimately connected with the LGBTQIA plus movement and the harms against our fucking brethren, and I just say that because since those days of youth programs, youth sports programs, a lot of natural organizing. We were organizing when we didn't know we were organizing. There seems to be this complexity that was born where all of a sudden you started seeing the criminalization of people who use drugs and sell drugs in the name of safety. And Lex, you've taught me so much on how, these systems use safety as a guise to pass laws that are very disruptive. And I said a lot in that, but I just think that's a really great starting point, because to all who listen, we really do want to turn this into a series. So we want to hear from others and hear your perspectives, to include, in these conversations. But thank you for having me, Lex, and I'm excited, to dive into, addiction with you.
Thank you for that. And I feel like you just really gave us a very perfect starting point. So nothing has a true beginning. Nothing really has an end either. But let's start in the 80s. And let's just start briefly in the 80s, because the 80s was the decade where all the shifts into the policies that we're still experiencing happened. So the 80s was a radical decade of reform, but not reform the way progressives fantasize about. The reforms came from the right. One of the biggest stories that people don't tell about the 80s, or they tell it incorrectly. You hear this all the time. Well, Ronald Reagan came in and he closed all the mental institutions and it forced all these people out into the street. What really happened was that we had a federal system run at the top of the government, run by the feds, that controlled the nation's mental institutions. And it was an example of bad government. And you had a lot of very poorly run and brutal mental institutions across the country, run in a very uniform way. And a lot of it got kind of, I think, exemplified, or at least it became the cultural reference of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or for comic book fans like Arkham Asylum and Batman and stuff like that. And then Jimmy Carter's administration signed into law, right, so pre-Reagan, reforms that would have localized those federal dollars. So instead of a uniform bureaucracy, you're going to have more locally administered clinical spaces that had more of a relationship with the communities they were responding to. I was going to say serving, but they were responding to. And that was going to be the plan, which was obviously a step forward. Let's localize these systems, but still fund them, but make them more democratic. And one of the first things Reagan did when he came into office was cut that funding. So that's what he did. He didn't close the institutions. He gutted a reform that was a good reform, cut the funding, which left them with nowhere to go. So effectively, yes, they got closed. But they got closed because in the middle of a plan, he just cut off the water, so to speak. And that's often cited by some folks like, oh, that created homelessness. Or that's why you see mentally ill folks on the street, is what people used to say. At least when we were growing up, right, Vanessa? People would say, oh, that's why you see that. So as a side note, all these folks moving into cities over the past 15, 20 years, all this boomerang of suburban white flight where families left the cities, moved to the suburbs. They raised a couple generations of young people who became adults who felt alienated from cities where the culture was happening and they wanted to go live a more civic reality. Then they moved back into the cities and gentrify them. You've created this really interesting, frustrating dissonance where even to this day, folks are moving into cities and talking about visible poverty in an urban context like they're so brand new about it. They're acting so shocked and appalled as if it's new. It's not new. You're new. So that's one of the frustrations. But to go back to the point, folks started moving back into the cities, gentrifying the cities. And what really happened as far as like homelessness is concerned, that started in the 80s and kind of boomeranged into this piece where it started to get more visible and more talked about out of context, was it wasn't just the institutions being defunded. What happened in addition to that, the other radical set of reforms that started in the 80s and got carried forth in the 90s was the deregulation of finance. And a lot of people blame Reagan for the they call it the Reagan Revolution, but the deregulation of finance, and rightfully so. But the other administration that had maybe even arguably a more radical hand in accelerating that was the Clinton administration, as far as financial deregulation is concerned. So all of those and many other granular legislative stories one could unpack led to an explosion in the cost of living and a massive separation as far as, what some people call the 1% or the haves and the have-nots. But it really polarized this country economically and has been a kind of long-standing erosion of the middle class. And in the midst of all of that, the other radical things that happened was the Crime Bill of 94, drafted by Joe Biden, signed by Bill Clinton, the so-called welfare reform bill, the gutting of welfare, Bill Clinton, the Immigration Bill of 96, which is a huge part of the reason why ICE gets to run wild today, Bill Clinton. And we also had the war on drugs, which, in my opinion, was a political front for the Cold War's activities in Central America, mainly the Caribbean, where the drug profits were used to fund anti-communist combat in Latin America mainly, primarily, but all over the world. And in a way that's just like, talk about playing in people's faces. You create drug wars, then you call it the war on drugs. And so our streets got flooded with drugs, with guns, and ultra-violence became the norm in the late 80s into the early 90s. And so Vanessa laid out really perfectly that in response to that, communities started doing something about it. And this is one of the stories that constantly gets lost, is that by the time LA exploded in 92, a lot of communities began coming together to do peace work, to negotiate peace among neighborhoods, to find ways around violence as an answer to problems, and to address the situation of drugs on the streets, and to provide care for all of the fringe economies that get created when you have this erosion of the middle class and now you have a lot of poverty. So people form other economies around drugs, around sex work. And folks in those communities started doing work to create more safety, to create more support, to create more mutual aid. And so Vanessa and I both grew up with that as our backdrop. Both, I think, did our first organizing and our first work in those spaces that were the solutions. And we saw from, especially, the mid-90s on, a lot of positive outcomes. The other big important factor that should be named here was the HIV crisis. And so when the HIV crisis also peaked in the 80s, and Ronald Reagan's administration refused to acknowledge it, and they didn't call it AIDS back then, they called it GRID, which stood for gay-related immune deficiency. And they refused to acknowledge it as a crisis until the Ryan White case happened, which was a young person becoming infected and passing away from a blood transfusion, where they no longer could say, oh, it's just because of, bathhouses in San Francisco. So all of this history led to the system responding to the human cost of these policy choices, be it the war on drugs, be it the denial of healthcare in response to the HIV crisis, be it the deregulation of finance, be it the gutting of public health spaces in 81. All of that created the first wave of visible poverty on the street en masse, or at least perceived that wave. The response was criminalization, which peaked with the 94 crime bill combined with welfare reform. And part of how they justified the 94 crime bill was coming out of the war on drugs, which we saw, the drug wars, which created so much violence in our streets. They said, see, the streets are out of control. We need to crack down. And it's important to name that the Democratic Party supported it, the legacy civil rights organizations supported it, and of course the Republicans loved it. So thank you guys both. When I say you guys, I'm talking about Vanessa and our amazing producer Geronimo, who are both here, for bearing with me of giving all of that history on top of the kind of really important foundation that Vanessa just gave us. And so let's talk about the world that we inherit from all of those factors, which is in 2026 a world where online discourse complains nonstop about drug addicts in the park, homeless encampments everywhere, and they're so horrified and they're so upset. No one's doing anything about it. And then, of course, there's a very funded narrative to say it's because of leftist policies that have created this. Real quick, we're not experiencing any leftist policies. We've never gotten to actually have leftist policies, and we need to have a conversation about what leftist policies even are. But let's just stop there. And I want to get back to talking to Vanessa about in 2026. I want to ask you, Vanessa, as somebody who doesn't subscribe to, Republican thinking or Democrat thinking or conservative thinking or liberal thinking, when you hear people complain about all the visible drug use and visible mental health issues on the streets, if you could sit that person down in a chair and say, let me explain to you what's really happening. So I'm that person right now. What would you say to me first? Help me understand what's really going on.
Well, I would think, Flex, and I would just say that, it's like the Just Say No campaign gone wrong. It's like, it's the police chief Daryl Gates's DPA's website has this really cool part to it where it says like the drug war history, right? And all, and on their website, they say that in 1981, Nancy Reagan began a highly publicized anti-drug campaign, the Just Say No campaign. And simultaneously, the Los Angeles police chief at that time, Daryl Gates, founded the DARE program, right? It's a drug education program. And Daryl Gates said casual drug users should be taken out and shot. So here are two people, and thank you for acknowledging, Lex, that I am, not left, not right. I don't subscribe to that, and at the same time, I love liberty, I love freedom, and when I say that, I mean I love body autonomy, I love openness. I'm a product of rape. My queer parent, back in their day, they didn't have a lot of the language that exists today, right? But I was born, because my mom, I grew up with my mom, my mom is my dad, right? So I grew up with two moms in the 80s. I am a product of rape. And my parents sold drugs because we needed to make ends meet. And if you were a trans man, you were not going to be employed, period. So there's that economic justice piece within that. Then I want to point to what you're saying of like the abandoning people of health systems. When in the 80s and the 90s, as queer people, would explore Hollywood and be at drag bars. I grew up at Plaza Salon, which is still in existence on Melrose and La Brea, next to Pink's, right? They would do these beautiful drag performances and also, a lot of celebration, right? People would come down to Hollywood to gay bash. And if you were a gay boy, you were going to get beat up by these hetero men that were just gonna, stick it to you. But a lot of people don't realize that if you were, a trans man, a person that was born in a female body that, identifies as more masculine, like my mom, slash dad, they were getting raped, right? Medical care and health services weren't reaching the people that were getting beat up, and my parent provided people a safe place. So as a child, I woke up seeing people injured in the living room, downstairs, and through my parents' very clever ways of making money, we were able to sustain things. I want to also point to the fact that my mother's wife was a caregiver, which gave us opportunity to live in Westwood. Where I'm going with this is you pointed to gentrification. So I can't think about gentrification and criminalization without thinking about the LA riots. And I remember as a kid being in Westwood, having access to a different level of education and spending time at my grandma's house, Pico Union neighborhood, later Normandy and Washington neighborhood. I started to see the differences on what I was learning in elementary school and what my cousins were learning in junior high, right? What they were learning in high school. The difference was huge. With the LA riots, I remember that was the first time that I saw, my family members that were all in public programs. All of a sudden I came down and they had gold chains. Everyone was looting. Everyone had big TVs. And all of a sudden, it was like half the city was burnt and the other half, I mean, it was like we were living large. And I remember the fear that I would hold in my body living in Westwood, seeing the destruction and recognizing that's where my family is. And I remember when I went down to see them, they were all living large. And I was so confused because on TV, it looked much different than what people were experiencing it. And again, to bring it back now to 2026, the way that people are experiencing life on TV looks different when the media gets a soundbite than what's actually happening. Because what's actually happening is that in 2026, we've had this booming of what Lex, what you've called like the community organizer to politician pipeline, right? So we have people that are entrusted to lead city council, to lead like the mayor's office. And we have, a great faith that as people of color, that they're going to understand the nuance and what our people want. But what happens, Lex, and and to all the listeners, is that we have a lack of accountability from the same monsters that we've helped to create, and I say that because people oftentimes want to give credit where credit is not due, right? Where credit is not due. And as far as Los Angeles is concerned, the entire city council needs to go. The mayor needs to go. And we truly need a whole reset button, because what we are seeing with the big games coming to town is there's been an uptick of cleaning the neighborhoods up. And we have been saying this for a long time. The Olympics are coming. The World Cup is coming. So we've been saying this for years now. And I know that it sounded a little wonky when we first said it, but what we were pointing to was, hey, because of the drug war, because of and fuck war period, right? But because of all these wars, we have created an energy around the globe where people are forced to migrate to the US, because while we're disrupting different nations, we're selling America's beauty on screen. And we have the #1 PR system in the world. It's called Hollywood, right? So we have the rest of the world seeing how beautiful and shiny America is. And, Lex, I thank you for allowing me to be my authentic self, because I'm one of the few that happen to love America. I just do. But I love the fabric of America because what it's given my family, and I can't do wrong by my grandparents, who with great pride migrated to this country and fell in love with the opportunities that they were given and what they created. So I want to share that what we're seeing is a complete breakdown of health systems, the legal system, and we are watching in real life people die before our eyes with this rapid push to clean up the cities because LA is about to have a big party. The sad part about this is that unfortunately, the housing crisis and the breakdowns of those same employment systems, those same health systems, have created an energy of vibration of what the USC Street Medicine team calls spiritual poverty. So it's not only financial poverty that people are being faced with, it's a spiritual poverty. It's being abandoned by all systems. And Monique of the Downtown Women's Action Coalition, she often says that Skid Row is a place when all systems fail, they just want to dump everybody in this place called Skid Row. Yet in Skid Row, there's a beauty there. There is a beauty, but you have to know where to find it. Where I'm going with it is, yes, there are tents. Yes, there are people who are dying in front of us. Yes, all that is happening. And I agree that the parks should go back to the children. And I agree that it is ridiculous for us to have to, watch people suffer. And, as a dope fiend, I'm gonna tell you, the drug supply is poisoned. So when we have the DEA working with informants, and when we have a breakdown of the LAPD where they stop doing their job and they start over relying on informants and the informant network, what starts to happen is that no one is ever going to be held accountable, because the systems that people think are created to protect communities are the same systems that are not only using our community members as informants, but they're also raping our people, they're beating our people. And I know many police officers that live with moral injury because when they went into police work, they grew up as little kids, I want to be a cop, and all of a sudden they enter the law enforcement workforce, and damn, that shit's the wild, wild west, especially in Los Angeles. So what we're seeing is when all systems fail, what starts to happen is that, one, we must legalize drugs because this drug supply is literally killing our people. It's no more of a like Nancy Reagan's just say no, because the just say no was actually for a certain group of people, for the people of wealth, for the people of higher class. Hey, let's teach your kids not to do drugs. Just say no. But that message wasn't relevant to the people that had that slow buildup of what was happening as displacement was coming to their local community, also known as gentrification. Because if the systems that be would just leave our people alone, we naturally are resilient. But because we're so resilient, we're going to bring the good food, the good music, right? The good culture. But then they want that too. All of a sudden, when the wealthy want to come in to the poor parts, yeah, then all of a sudden it creates a dysfunction. And I'm not sure if I went on too long. I'm so
No,
sorry.
you said a bunch of things that are the point, and I want to unpack it with you because at the end of the day, we're having this conversation because we're both struggling. We're both struggling watching the story be told incorrectly. And that only matters because the problem then gets assessed incorrectly, and then the solutions get offered incorrectly. And it's just so frustrating. And then we have a very broken LA. The Olympics are coming. The World Cup's already here. And it's so apropos of the problem we're talking about that when the World Cup arrives, the warehouse fire in Boyle Heights happens. And it's so indicative of LA and how LA loves to fail all the time. And then people like to blame the folks with the least amount of power. And so you said a couple things that I want to highlight. One, you mentioned, we both talk about this, right? The organizer to politician pipeline. The organizer to politician pipeline is one of the most toxic, misguided, political pieces of misdirection that hurts our folks all the time. It's also important to name that it's not new. The organizer to politician pipeline is how movements get captured. It's how movements get co-opted. It's how movements get gentrified. You mentioned that there's a spiritual, political, and a material that get culturally and spiritually gentrified through the gathering into the political establishment. And worst of all, it allows for really harmful policies that are one could even say are right-wing policies to get carried out by so-called progressive faces and voices. And the movements that kind of culminated in the 60s, for example, very radical movements. And LA is often such an important part of those stories. George Jackson, to me, is one of the most important figures when we talk about movements, and where the idea of the fight for abolition came from against carceral systems. George Jackson, who was from, who grew up in Los Angeles. Him and his brother grew up in Pasadena. But the reason I bring that up is because a movement that at that point is saying, hey, this system's not reformable and this system has to be replaced. And then you have the civil rights struggle. And out of the civil rights struggle, you have really groundbreaking, transformative federal legislation comes out of it, the Civil Rights Act. But what also came out of it was a whole generation, 3, if not 4 generations of politicians came out of the civil rights movement. Legacy nonprofit organizations established themselves out of the civil rights movement. Many existed before, but they truly became established, began having large offices in Washington, D.C., became intertwined with the Democratic Party. And this happened with the labor movement a half century, if not a whole century before, where workers were fighting for their rights. And then big labor movements eventually became very connected to our two-party system. The organizer to politician pipeline has been where they leave a struggle, but claim to still be a part of the struggle and say, I'm going to represent that struggle now in the halls of legislative power. And that's, of course, not what happens. And you got to think about it this way. Imagine you're going to, let's say you're in high school and you and your fellow classmates are treated badly. Vanessa and I both at least spent a couple years at public high schools in the LA area. And I wasn't in high school very long. I don't think you were either, but we weren't missing much because they weren't particularly good places. The food was bad. The treatment was punitive. The facilities weren't good. I didn't have a good time. I know you didn't have a good time. And that feeling of being disgruntled and denied and being like, I'm going to advocate for us to have better conditions here. And we deserve better food. We deserve better treatment. We deserve less punitive responses to our decisions, our growth as young people. So we're going to pressure the administration to do things better. And whether you realize it or not, and I don't mean you, Vanessa, and I don't mean me, I mean anybody who's listening. At some point in your life, you had an experience, could have been in elementary school, junior high, high school. At some point in your growing up, you had an experience where you and your peers came together and fought the administration of whatever you were experiencing for things to change and be better. And you forced them to do something different. They listened to you. So be it school, be it any other institution, prison, be it the institution of our country. Everything is an institution that you live in and participate in. We're going to fight this to make it better. So let's say you're in high school, you're in prison. Okay, cool. I'm going to be our representative to go talk to them, to deliver our demands. I'm going to go let the administration know what we're saying. Oh, actually, I've decided to join the administration. Now I'm actually working for the principal, but I'm representing you in that relationship. What would you say? You would say, get the fuck out of here. No, you're not. Yet with government, we have accepted people leaving our spaces, our coalitions to go join the government with this fantasy in mind that they're going to represent us in there. Think about whatever decision you make. If you mentioned being a cop. I've grown up with plenty of people who went off to become cops and sheriffs and prison guards. Some of them are good folks, some of them are not, but that's not the point. The point is once they join that institution, their sympathies live with that institution. Their sympathies don't live with the community, even if initially that's what they wanted to do. If you are a baseball player playing for the Dodgers and then you sign with the Pirates, which would in this day be the other way around. Let's say you play for the Pirates and you sign with the Dodgers. you're no longer rooting for the Pirates, you're rooting for the Dodgers. So if you're from coming out of the community and you join the government, you're no longer rooting for the community. Your sympathies live with the government. That's what you've aligned yourself with. But even if you think you haven't, this idea that you represent the struggles of the community as an administrator is not true. So this function of movements that we then take our demands and take our power and hand it over to a representative who then walks into the government has destroyed us. And it's just done profound harm to social movements in this country. And we can list a million examples. LA City Council is one of them. This idea that there's, socialists in LA City Council. There are Democrats in LA City Council who are mainstream Democrats who get cheered on by groups that call themselves socialists, who don't have deep community ties in Los Angeles, who are very ahistoric and without context. Different conversation, but a microcosm certainly of this other point around gentrification. So this goes into the other piece. You said credit where it's not due. Your mother and many other people that we both saw, including ourselves, there was incredible mutual aid work that developed out of the drug wars in response to the crisis of the drug wars. Incredible mutual aid work and service work and nonprofit work that developed out of the HIV crisis, that saved a lot of lives, that employed a lot of young people to work with other young people, including me. That's how I got my first employment, was they hired peer educators, youth from the community to work with other youth in the community. It changed everybody's life. It helped everybody. There were queer-led, trans-led health service groups that demanded the opportunity to provide peer-led services. That's what worked. That's what helped completely change the trajectory of the HIV crisis. There was neighborhood peace work, right? Gangbangers getting together with other gangbangers to say, we've got to stop killing each other. That worked when it was done. It was sabotaged, it was undermined, but when it was done, it worked. That's what lowered the violence. So folks moving to LA in this wave of gentrification, and some of them say, well, I'm a right winger and I'm going to vote for Spencer Pratt and I'm just going to pretend like all homeless people are dangerous. And I'm going to get on Twitter and I'm going to cry and complain. And this odd thing I didn't expect from the right, but I should have, is how profoundly lost in nostalgia they are. But right-wing nostalgia for what America used to be is always in response to movies and commercials. It's unreality. You guys get nostalgic about a world that never existed. You'll talk about, this is what California used to look like, and it's a freaking like double mint gum commercial from 1983. It's so interesting to witness the racist nostalgia they have. It's not based in reality, and they just cry and they complain and they weep. So that's a quick critique about the right, the online right. I thought y'all were all about masculinity, and you're the most unmanly, weepy, complainy Karens I've ever seen in my life. And then you want to vote for Spencer Pratt, who tells you to be afraid all the time. Oh, I'm so scared of these encampments. You'll get stabbed. You'll get this. You'll get that. Fear, fear, fear. It's just like the most like the words. I'm not going to use the words I would describe for how it lands. I'm like, you're just scared of everybody, huh? Okay. But then on the other side, you have this wave of folks calling themselves progressive. I'm speaking in generalizations here, or generalities. I never know what's the word. Coming to LA, joining formations like DSA, claiming to be progressive. And they are gentrifiers who have a completely ahistoric idea of what Northeast LA is, of what East LA is, of what South LA is. Even the fact that they call it South LA is telling on themselves. But they will talk about Los Angeles and they will vote progressive, but they will vote for the idea of progressivism. And it manifests usually in oddly conservative things like control of space. They're all about bike lanes, but bike lanes actually put a squeeze on working people in LA.
Yes.
But it's like some civic progressive thing. And it becomes this like almost like soft apartheid of spaces. We want our urban theme park over here, and we want to actually make it harder for working people to like get to work on the thoroughfares that they've relied on their whole lives. They talk about transit in a fantasy context without actually talking about what it would really be like to apply that. But also, they have reduced these struggles that they weren't there for. So when we saw folks doing all this amazing work in the 80s and 90s that saved all of our lives, they don't know about that. So they perpetuate that fantasy that we just need to elect progressive people and then we'll get progressive solutions. And it's very lazy and it's very cultural. So that's the LA that we're dealing with. And when you were talking, you pointed to all of these issues across the board, including this issue around drug use and substance use, which the right says, oh, they're all criminals and they need to be locked up. And I love that you mentioned Daryl Gates and Pete Wilson, because I bet you none of these folks know about them. Daryl Gates and Pete Wilson were two of the most violent mouthpieces for right-wing rhetoric towards people who used drugs. And they pushed incredibly violent responses to that. You know, there's the famous rap song by Toddy T, The Batter Ram. And a lot of folks don't know about that, but if you saw the movie Straight Outta Compton, the movie about NWA, the first scene of that film was Eazy-E doing a dope deal, and the batter ram comes and knocks the whole house down. That's how communities involved in the drug trade were being treated, with like the most cutting edge military technology of the time, literally knocking their house down, and them being treated like the scourge of the earth, and then constant media narratives talking the most horrible talk about people on welfare, about people in prison. And it was savage, and it was nasty, and it was so mean, and it was so incorrect. So you have the right who talk about drug users like they're criminals and they're irredeemable and we've tried everything, so they need to go to jail. When the truth is they've all already been in jail, and that's a huge reason that they're on the street. So jail already failed them. One of the many reasons. The other issue then is, though, you will have folks on the progressive side saying, you know, drug use shouldn't be criminalized. And they're correct. Yes, it should not be criminalized. But then they'll say, you know, drug use should just be like a cool recreational thing, and it's not
right.
a big. And what you said about the drug supply being poison is really important, because for whatever nefarious reasons, we saw it with crack in the 80s, we're seeing it with fentanyl now. Drugs don't organically appear. Somebody's creating super drugs when they feel like it and dumping them in poor communities, and it kills a bunch of people, and it feeds a police narrative, it feeds a militarization narrative. Remember, we talked about Reagan in the beginning. Reagan's austerity politics cut everything. Education, normalized the cutting of everything. Education, housing, food, SNAP, welfare, etc. The only things that have survived austerity have been policing and the military. One of the things that they use to justify that is, you know, illicit drugs. So these drugs show up, and things like crack and things like fentanyl that start killing people and they are poison is a real crisis. And even when they're not killing people, they're getting folks high in a way that's new and that's scary. And both Vanessa and I can talk. Like, you spend time in, well, you wanted to respond, so let me stop.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, it's like one thing that I just get so frustrated by is, like, people want to vote against safe consumption sites, but bars are safe consumption sites. Like, once upon a time, alcohol was viewed the way that some of our favorite drugs are viewed, like Coke or marijuana or whatever, you know, and I find it very frustrating that, like, I've never been into alcohol a lot. I like to just, when I use drugs, I like slamming drugs. So I like using slamming meth or slamming heroin, smoking crack. Like, I just like the intensity of those highs. Um, I mean, sometimes it got a little embarrassing, I must admit, right? Oh my God. I'm glad there wasn't footage of that. Or maybe not. Fuck it, you know? But if I had a safe place to use, then the way I used looked differently. So when I was cracked out at 16 years old, because I had a home that where I was allowed to, you know, I could use drugs, I actually went into treatment much younger than a lot of people. You know, I did experience incarceration, and I did spend time in solitary confinement, you know, and shout out Dolores Canales and all her amazing work, you know, and Jessica Solis and so many others. But my point is that when people have the built health environment, when people have, you know, social drivers of health, overall in their community, they oftentimes won't hit such low lows. It's when the foundational framework is broken that creates such havoc. Sorry.
No, it's really, again, when I mentioned like how progressive folks moving into the community, um, perpetuating this fantasy that they can elect, it's simply just, electing people and ignoring how we got here. And the people who choose to leave who choose to leave organizing to become politicians, they cut deals on their way up, which also destroys a lot of that momentum. And it's very sad because you mentioned safe consumption sites, you mentioned on the ground treatment services. People use terms like street medicine now, but it's both good and bad, because when it becomes a buzzword, again, in some ways you're co-opting it. Formally and more importantly, informally, people create safe consumption sites. They create street medicine opportunities. And those are always destroyed by things like sweeps, sanitation sweeps, which is a horrible euphemism because it's not sanitation. Everybody wants clean streets. Sanitation sweeps is about moving people, not moving trash. And when you move people, you're destroying those networks that actually are often keeping people safer. But it's easy to say, oh no, it was this nuisance of an encampment over here. Because yeah, there's plenty of nuisance. There's plenty of folks on the streets who are misbehaving. And there's also plenty of folks on the streets who are doing work that keeps everybody fed, that creates real street medicine, that keeps everybody safe, that keeps people cool during heat waves. The other problem with sweeps, obviously, is that folks aren't getting swept into sustained housing, into dignified housing. And the city loves to pass the buck and claim it's not their fault and claim they don't know when these things are happening. And with MacArthur Park, not only has fencing been put up, but also hostile architecture has been put up on the streets. This stuff attacks the poor. Meanwhile, nothing gets built up for poor folks. And I don't even like the word poor, but for lack of a better term, it attacks the folks who aren't wealthy. And this is policies that are not seen as, these are right-wing policies. Hostile architecture is an anti-poor policy, and yet we have so-called progressives pushing it. And this is why you don't elect people as a solution. Whoever is in office, whoever they are, they only respond to pressure. The only movement we get is when everybody is forced to know what's going on. So pressure and transparency, and that only comes from, the transparency only comes from the pressure. So if you want to call yourself an organizer, but all you organize to do is get people elected, then you are a counterinsurgent as far as I'm concerned. You are anti-community as far as I'm concerned, because all you want to do is usher the power back into the government. And this idea that progressives in government all of a sudden makes government not the government is, just like I said, one of the most toxic fantasies we deal with. So I don't care who is in city council. They should be treated like they are the government, and the government's not going to do anything unless we kick their ass into doing it. And we should never consider them the ones who hold all the solutions. We kick their ass into doing the solutions that we know, that we carry out. And then once those solutions start to happen, we have to stay on top of them still. And that's the hard part about organizing, is you never get to let up on the government. And this idea that you have friends in government. You're betraying your community when you think you have a friend in the government. You're betraying your community if you're talking to the government every day. I don't care what you guys are talking about. These things are incredibly important to understand, especially if you consider yourself a progressive and you want to elect socialists, and you want socialism as an idea where resources get shared equitably. Everybody fundamentally wants resources shared equitably, regardless of whatever political tent they place their analysis under. The government and the oligarchs operate the same way if you let them. Government is an oligarchy if you let it be. Oligarchs are the government if you let it be. They are not your friends. They are people who hold resources. They are institutions who hold resources. And if you sign up to be a part of that institution and refuse to challenge it, and I've yet to see someone who actually challenges it, all it does is affirm that we need to challenge it. So MacArthur Park's one example of these failures that keep happening in Los Angeles. And so in New York, They've also been electing socialists. A lot of people are really excited about it. We shall see. We'll see how that looks there. But in Los Angeles, they're not socialists. They are Democrats who fall in line with the Democratic power structure. California is the home of the Democratic donor base. California is the home of the Democratic Party's kind of oligarchic bosses, Nancy Pelosi, etc. And so far, all of the so-called progressive politicians have fallen in line for that. It's the home of the Resnicks, of the donor class. And that's who we see they answer to at the end of the day. All of the so-called progressives have endorsed Karen Bass. There's a reason for that. It has nothing to do with policy and has everything to do with falling in line and waiting their turn and doing what they're told by the bosses of the Democratic Party. And that's just abundantly clear. And it's clear that the priority for these folks is not health and liberation and dignity for the people suffering in Los Angeles, because there are clear solutions, as you said. There should be, first of all, things that work have been done before. Networks of drop-in centers that are thriving and well-funded, networks of safe consumption sites that are thriving and well-funded and protected, children's programming that doesn't involve fencing and is consistent and accessible and done with well-trained people and not just the photo op. All that stuff works really, really well when it's done. And like I said, when there was this kind of moment of investment in the mid-90s through into the early 2000s, we saw tremendous outcomes. Things got a lot safer. Things got a lot better. And unfortunately, Chief Bratton came to LA, took credit for that. We didn't have our own reporting mechanisms back then. And a lot of the stories of really what worked got lost, or even worse, attributed to some sort of success of broken windows policing. What I also love is that it wasn't until towards the end of this conversation that we even mentioned the term addiction. And I really am glad for that, because addiction, if we're being honest, is a whole separate conversation. Talking about addiction is like talking about grief. It's like talking about healing. It's like talking about psychology. Addiction is very personal. Addiction requires a very personal conversation. The idea that addiction is a social driver of poverty on the streets is bullshit. There are addicts of every class. There are addicts of every race. There are addicts who represent every experience. There are addicts on the street in MacArthur Park, and there are addicts in the biggest mansion that you've never seen in Brentwood. It's not about addiction. Addiction needs to be talked about in the same way we talk about early childhood development, in the same way we talk about grief, in the same way we talk about all of our most complicated emotional experiences with ourselves, about trauma. It's very important. It's not a driver of the issues that we want to shape policy around. The driver of homelessness is lack of access to housing, is cost of living issues. The main driver of the drug wars was the flooding of communities with guns and drugs. That access to guns turns violence into ultra-violence, turns regular conflicts into deadly conflicts. These things need to be talked about honestly. And for all you out there who keep voting for progressive electeds, they're not going to talk about it honestly. And I'm not telling you how to vote or who to vote for, because in LA, we don't have any good options. So I don't blame you for casting whatever vote you think is best. I'm not anti-voting, by the way. Voting is a tool. It's not an outcome. Elections are a byproduct, not an outcome. We are the change we want to see. The pressure we put on all folks in power, be it government, be it oligarchs, the pressure towards our demands is how we get somewhere. It's the what, not the who. So that's the last thing I'll say. What are your final thoughts, Vanessa? Because obviously we're going to be having this conversation at least every couple months, if not more frequently.
Yeah. No, I want to have it more frequently, Lex, because I think if we just roll it out in a string, it's going to be better. I just want to keep the conversation going. The last thing I'll say is that as ridiculous as this may sound, like love wins. I feel that you nailed it when you just pointed to what we want is we're building up communities that are sustainable and that aren't filled with these short-sighted solutions. I thank you for understanding that, as a person committed to long-term recovery that has navigated and navigates addiction and in its many forms, that is a very personal component of my life and that of many people. But we do recover. And not only do we recover and we're able to do amazing things with the experiences that we've survived to tell the stories too. I think that this dialogue is very important because we are touching on so many parts of what creates the system's failures that we are watching in real time. And we're just, grasping our pearls in all of the level of insult to injury that continues when we continue to go along with the okey doke and allow these people to get credit for leading our cities. They have led our cities to the fucking ground, and we are now at a ground level building up unapologetically, coming at things from all different perspectives.
Well, I appreciate you. This is great. To be continued. We're going to invest in continuing to have this conversation because we just really want to do whatever we can to make sure folks are talking honestly about these issues that seem to upset them so much. So thank you. Let's wrap up. To be continued. Thank you, Geronimo. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, APHC. I'll see you guys later.